The greatest trick the empires of this world ever pulled was not convincing you that war is necessary. It was convincing you that God is the one commanding it. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and picture a deeply unsettling image. It is an image we have seen repeated across centuries, across continents, and across political administrations. Picture a leader standing behind a podium, a flag draped perfectly in the background, announcing the beginning of a military campaign. They talk about threats, they talk about security, and they talk about the inevitable deployment of young men and women into the theater of war. And then, without fail, they lower their eyes, adjust their posture to appear incredibly solemn, and they end their speech with a prayer. They ask God to bless the troops. They ask the Almighty to guide their missiles, to sanction their violence, and to grant victory to their specific piece of geography. We watch this on our televisions and our smartphone screens, and we do not even blink. We have become entirely desensitized to the most profound blasphemy in the modern world. We have normalized the grotesque marriage of the cross and the sword. We have allowed politicians, kings, and modern-day emperors to hijack the creator of the universe and turn him into a cosmic mascot for their geopolitical agendas. Look historically at how this mechanism of manipulation operates. The architecture of war is incredibly ugly. Stripped of its patriotic marketing, war is fundamentally about power, territory, and resources. It is about control over oil beneath the desert. It is about maintaining dominance in international waters. It is about securing economic leverage. And it is about the egos of men sitting in air-conditioned rooms, moving human lives around like pieces on a chessboard. But here is the psychological reality that every empire knows. You cannot convince a mother to send her 18-year-old son into a bloody, terrifying combat zone just so a corporation can secure a better trade route. You cannot ask a young person to endure the horrific trauma of the battlefield, to take another human life, and to come home with their mind completely shattered merely to protect the profit margins of the military-industrial complex. The human conscience naturally revolts against the killing of its own kind. So, how do you override that innate human morality? How do you get millions of decent, everyday people to support the dropping of bombs on neighborhoods they have never visited, on people they have never met? You need a psychological scaffolding that is stronger than human logic. You need the ultimate trump card. You need to tell them it is a holy cause. You must baptize the violence. You must convince the population that they are not fighting for land or oil, but that they are the chosen instruments of divine justice. When you wrap imperialism in the sacred text, when you tell a soldier that God is riding in the tank with them, you entirely bypass the moral conscience. You make questioning the war equal to questioning God himself. This is the ultimate, most devastating form of political manipulation in human history. But what if I told you that the God who sanctions your national wars, the God who always seems to perfectly align with your country's foreign policy, is not the God of the universe? What if that God is simply an idol, carved out of the wood of your own national ego, painted in the colors of your flag, and worshipped because it demands nothing from you but your blind allegiance? Let us completely dismantle this psychological illusion and look at the brutal, historical truth that mainstream religion often desperately tries to cover up. To understand this, we have to look at the psychological concept of the sacred canopy, a term coined by sociologist Peter Berger. Human beings are terrified of meaninglessness. When we engage in the horror of violence, we desperately need a sacred canopy to shield us from the psychological terror of what we are doing. We need to believe that the heavens are applauding our destruction. Throughout history, almost every single invading army marched under this canopy. The belt buckles of the soldiers in some of the most horrific regimes of the 20th century literally had the words, "God is with us," engraved into the metal. The Crusaders painted crosses on their shields before slaughtering entire villages. Both sides of almost every major global conflict have prayed to the exact same God for the absolute destruction of the other. Do you see the terrifying cognitive dissonance here? We have turned the divine into a celestial vending machine for military victory. But if we claim to follow the Christian tradition, if we claim to look at the historical Jesus of Nazareth, this entire narrative violently collapses. The modern church has largely forgotten who Jesus actually was. The algorithm of popular religion portrays Jesus as a tame, agreeable figure who exists to make sure your country thrives and your economy grows. But the Jesus of history was a radical, countercultural dissident who lived in the shadow of the most brutal military empire the world had ever seen, the Roman Empire. Rome had a specific theology. It was called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. But the Pax Romana was a peace achieved exclusively through overwhelming, terrifying military violence. Rome's message was simple. We will crush our enemies. We will crucify insurgents. We will burn down your cities. And through that absolute dominance, we will bring peace to the world. Caesar was not just an emperor, he demanded to be worshipped as the Son of God. And right into the middle of that militarized, hyper-patriotic, violent empire, Jesus steps onto the scene. And what does he say? He does not command his followers to take up swords and overthrow Rome. He does not wave a national flag. He stands on a mountain and delivers a manifesto that completely shatters the illusion of the empire. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." He says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Do you understand how incredibly dangerous those words were? In a society built entirely on military supremacy, telling people to love their enemies was not a sweet, sentimental greeting card, quote. It was an act of high treason. It was a direct psychological and theological attack on the machinery of the empire. When Jesus is arrested and standing trial before Pilate, the representative of the Roman military machine, Pilate asks him about his kingdom. And Jesus makes a definitive, eternal statement that the modern political world tries to ignore. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Look at that profound boundary line. Jesus explicitly untangles the kingdom of heaven from the machinery of human violence. He tells Pilate, "The empire you serve relies on swords, intimidation, and blood. My reality operates on an entirely different frequency." When Peter, his closest friend, pulls out a sword to defend Jesus from being arrested, Jesus rebukes him. He says, "Put your sword away, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." This is the agonizing truth that tears down our sacred canopies. Jesus was not killed by a random mob. He was executed by an alliance between corrupt religious leaders who wanted to maintain their political power and a military empire that saw his message of radical nonviolence as a threat to national security. The Savior of the world was a victim of state-sanctioned violence, justified by religious leaders. So how on earth did we get from a Messiah who allowed himself to be crucified rather than fight back, to modern religious leaders cheering for drone strikes on the evening news? How did the church, which spent its first 300 years as a pacifist movement of martyrs, become the loudest cheerleader for preemptive strikes and global dominance? It happened when we made a deal with the devil. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine supposedly looked up into the sky before a major battle and saw a vision of the cross, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine painted the symbol of Christ on the shields of his soldiers and went on to slaughter his enemies. In that exact moment, a devastating psychological shift occurred. The cross stopped being an instrument of execution that Jesus suffered on, and it became a weapon of imperial power. We traded the suffering servant for a military mascot, and we are still paying the terrifying price for that psychological shift today. I am speaking directly to those of you who have felt a deep, sickening pit in your stomach when you watch the news. You are watching historical conflicts in the Middle East, you are watching tensions flare globally, and you hear commentators and even pastors using apocalyptic, biblical language to justify the absolute devastation of human lives. You hear people casually referencing prophecies to excuse the starvation of children or the bombing of civilian infrastructure. If watching that has made you deeply angry, if it has made you question your faith, if it has made you want to walk away from religion entirely, I want to tell you something incredibly important right now. Your anger is not a sin. Your disgust is not a sign that you are losing your faith. Your disgust is the most profound evidence that your conscience is actually working. Your outrage is a holy outrage. You are intuitively recognizing the ultimate spiritual fraud. You are realizing that calling an act of brutal, politically motivated destruction the will of God is the deepest form of spiritual abuse. It is taking the name of the Lord in vain. We always think taking God's name in vain means using a swear word when we stub our toe. No, taking the Lord's name in vain is attaching the name of the divine creator to your political campaign, to your military invasion, or to your ethnic hatred. It is claiming divine authority for your own darkness. This channel is fundamentally about healing. But we cannot truly heal our individual souls until we untangle our minds from the toxic, violent narratives of the culture we live in. Religious nationalism is a psychological trauma. It breaks the human spirit because it creates a terrifying God. If you are taught that God is a cosmic nationalist who delights in the destruction of foreigners to protect your borders, you will never, ever feel truly safe with him. Because deep down, your subconscious knows that a God who demands the blood of other people's children is a monster. And you cannot find inner peace, you cannot heal your own anxiety if the God you are praying to is fundamentally a God of war. We have to completely reprogram how we view the divine. The true God is not a tribal warlord. God does not sit in the heavens wearing the jersey of your favorite political party. God is not an American. God is not a European. God does not have a favorite passport. God is the creator of the intricate, fragile, profoundly beautiful human soul. Whether that soul is born in New York, in Tehran, in Jerusalem, or in Moscow. When a bomb drops on a neighborhood, God is not standing with the general who gave the order. God is in the rubble with the mother weeping over her child. God is with the broken, the marginalized, and the victims of the empire's insatiable greed. The cross is not a symbol of how God destroys his enemies. The cross is the ultimate symbol of how God absorbs the violence of the world into himself, refusing to retaliate and proving that sacrificial love is eternally stronger than military might. We must stop letting politicians be our theologians. We must stop letting cable news anchors interpret the sacred texts. They have a vested interest in keeping you terrified, tribal, and ready to fight. Fear is the most profitable commodity on earth. If they can make you fear the outsider, if they can convince you that the people across the ocean or across the border are demons sent to destroy your way of life, they can control your vote, your money, and your mind. True spiritual healing requires an act of radical rebellion. It requires you to lay down the weapons of self-righteousness and tribalism. It requires you to look at the people your government tells you to hate, the people the media tells you to fear, and forcefully recognize the image of God stamped intimately into their humanity. The next time you hear a leader standing behind a podium invoking the name of the Almighty to justify the mobilization of weapons, The next time you hear a religious figure manipulating Scripture to demand the annihilation of a nation, I want you to remember the temptation in the wilderness. Before Jesus began his ministry, he was driven into the desert and tempted by the devil. And the final, ultimate temptation was not about food or personal pleasure. The devil took Jesus to a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their military glory, and said, "I will give all of this to you. I will give you the political power. I will give you the armies. I will give you the empires. All you have to do is bow down to me." Satan offered Jesus the exact same political and military power that modern leaders claim is God's will. And Jesus looked at the ultimate prize of human history, the power to rule the world by force, and he said no. He rejected the sword. He rejected the empire. So, I leave you with this final, piercing thought. Let it echo in the quiet spaces of your mind long after this video ends. Let it challenge the very foundations of what you have been taught about faith and patriotism. If the God you worship always happens to hate the exact same people that your government hates, if your God's geopolitical enemies magically perfectly align with your political party's enemies, if your God sanctions your wars, blesses your economy at the expense of others, and demands the blood of your rivals, you are not worshiping the Creator of the universe. You are worshiping a mirror. You are worshiping your own reflection, wrapped in a flag, and you are calling it holy. It is time to smash the mirror. It is time to step out from under the empire's sacred canopy. Stop letting them use God to justify their wars, and start seeking the God who heals the very wounds those wars have created.